Ning is professor of art history and theory at Peking University and the author of a number of award-winning books, including 15 lectures on Western art history and The Spectrum of Images Toward a Cultural Dimension of Visual Art, as well as a television series entitled Heart-Moving Western Art. Professor Ding has also translated into Chinese 7 books on Western art and museology. Please welcome.
Presumably, I'm not the only one who is overcoming the serious jet lag. So if I say something wrong in English, it's not my fault. However, first of all, my sincere thanks go to the Smithsonian American Art Museum as well as the Taylor Foundation. My topic is about tropes and achievements, some cases of mutual Chinese-American influence in art. That both Chinese and American artists benefit from each other's cultural and artistic impact is a fact obvious to all. And no doubt those tropes surpassing direct imitations have become a valuable visual experience of creation, which should be substantially recorded in the specific art history. However, at least in current Chinese academic circles, study of the interactive influence between Chinese and American art seem to have just begun. On one hand, though some American artists were indeed inspired by Chinese culture and art, very little elaborate research has been done concerning this specific influence. And even if it is touched upon, historical data has been compiled, but no further reflection or analysis has followed. The key to the mutual influence lies in tropes and creative achievements. And only on that level could one much more clearly realize its innermost significance. On the other hand, how Chinese art, particularly contemporary Chinese art, has been influenced by American art has been only too roughly studied. One seems to be more accustomed to believe that only the art with a long history could produce an essential impact on other young art and not vice versa. It is particularly important to see that within certain periods of time, the influence of American art on contemporary Chinese art did not seem to be a purely individual connection between an American artist and a Chinese counterpart, but rather a far more profound and lasting process. Even a group of quite talented Chinese artists were inspired greatly in terms of technique, style, and concept. They created a large number of works with unique historical and artistic value, were prominently written into the history of contemporary Chinese art, and became an important record of visual culture for an era. Studies of this topic still leave much to be explored. In this paper, some cases concerning the mutual influence of Chinese and American art are discussed in the hope that its characteristics may be described and summarized. First, let's deal with the influence of Chinese art upon American art. Here, the outcome of the communication and friendship between Teng Baiye and Mark Tobey can be a typical example for tropes and establishments. General art history offers pages on American painter Mark Tobey, mentioning that he was influenced by Persian and Far Eastern drawing and calligraphy, and that he went to Japan to study brushwork in a Zen monastery. However, among all the influences that Mark Tobey received, the most conducive to the formation of Mark Tobey's own unique style was undoubtedly the impact of Chinese art. The Chinese artist Teng Baiye not only taught Chinese painting and calligraphy to Mark Tobey, but more fundamentally, influenced the latter in terms of artistic concept. Unfortunately, in the history of modern Chinese art, Teng Baiyi himself has occupied no place at all, as one cannot find his name and works in any available textbooks of the kind, let alone the acclaims which he deserves. Although he set a remarkable record in areas like print, Chinese painting, sculpture, and academic publication, and even influenced significantly outstanding artists like Mark Tooby, very few scholars truly know his real contribution to both Chinese and American art history. And only occasionally and rather briefly has his artistic career been dealt with in a small amount of data. More sadly, even in today's art auctions, a few of his artworks from scholars' collection have also been overlooked, and their value has been surprisingly underestimated. At least in China, it can be said Teng Baiyi is also forgotten artist. Nevertheless, why could Teng Baiyi influence Mark Tooby to such a degree that the latter could not forget it during his lifetime? If examined very carefully, there are quite a few reasons to list. Above all, Mark Tooby would not be able to encounter a more ideal artistic partner than Teng Baiyi. First, Teng Baiyi preferred traditional Chinese art tremendously, though he studied Western art. Meanwhile, he did create a large number of excellent water and ink works, particularly some finger paintings. He was well versed in English, which was somehow rare among Chinese artists and students. As he studied and obtained a MFA degree at the University of Washington and conducted a special project at the Yanjing Institute, Harvard University, with the recommendation of John Layton Stewart, president of Yanjing University back then. So presumably, he could feel at ease introducing Mark Tooby to the very essence of traditional Chinese art, in contrast to Western art, with which he was also quite familiar. His knowledge of Chinese art and his straight-to-the-point ideas concerning both Chinese and Western art were further demonstrated in his English publications and lectures. The Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago once invited Teng Baiyi to give a lecture on his own work, mainly fig painting in water and ink, displayed at the Society. From 1927 to 1928, Teng Baiyi was invited to teach at the University of Washington after acquiring his master's degree, and very possibly he was the first Chinese artist to teach in an American higher education institution. Second, Teng Baiyi himself was not a mediocre artist. On the contrary, he was among only a few modern Chinese artists who were highly acclaimed in the West. As already mentioned above, Teng Baiyi was selected to hold a one-person show at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago. And obviously, the extent to which he was accepted and appreciated was unusual. The Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago was founded in 1915, and for decades, it has been a quite important museum. As one of the oldest American museums devoted exclusively to contemporary art, the Society has witnessed the finest of avant-garde, both from the US and the rest of the world. It was directed by even Watson Swartz and held an influential exhibition in which Arp, Brancusi, Miho, and Picasso participated. Among some of the one-person shows, there were the foreign celebrities like Henry Matisse, Alexander Calder, John Sloan, Paul Klee, René Magritte, and Henry Moore. Before the year 1930, Teng Baiyi had his one-person shows in Henley Art Gallery, Washington University, and East-West Fine Art Gallery, San Francisco. However, Teng Baiyi's most important one-person show was the one held by the Renaissance Society. Actually, it was Dr. Laufer who introduced Teng Baiye to the society. As one of the most influential American sinologists, Dr. Laufer was curator of archæology, ethnology, and anthropology at the Field Museum. In 1930, the exhibition of the paintings of Teng Baiye was sponsored by the Renaissance Society and American Friends of China. As we all know, Dr. Laufer was indeed an extremely knowledgeable and productive scholar, and it must be his very prudent decision to recommend Teng Baiye to the Renaissance Society. How Dr. Laufer had acquaintance with Teng Baiye and appreciated the latter's works is surely a very intriguing topic for scholars. Along with the exhibition of the paintings of Teng Baiye, there was displayed examples of antique Chinese art loaned by the Art Institute of Chicago and some members of the Renaissance Society. According to the available but incomplete data, Teng Baiye also participated in the group exhibition of paintings, sculpture, and drawing by American and foreign artists in 1929, Brooklyn Museum. His lithographer landscape was accepted at the Second International Exhibition of Lithography and Wood Carving at Art Institute of Chicago, which opened in 1930. He was one of the only two Chinese artists attending the exhibition. His Rain on the Yangtze, another piece, is now permanently kept at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Teng Baiye majored in sculpture, so no one can no longer view any of his original works. But senior historians and perhaps close friend to him, Mr. Zhang Yimei, recorded that in 1935, there was an art competition for the best portrait sculpture of Sun Yat-sen. And Teng Baiye finally came to the fore and was listed first among many rivals. Amazingly, Teng Baiye's artistic talent extended as far as to the arena of design. His interior design was absolutely remarkable. In 1931, he designed the Chinese Nationality Room for the famed Nationality Rooms at the Cathedral of Learning, the University of Pittsburgh. Third, the relationship between Teng Baiye and Mark Tobey is not of the category of ordinary friends. Indeed, the communication between the two started as early as 1923 when they met each other. And in 1938, 15 years later, Teng Baiye still wrote to Mark Tobey. It was in 1923 when Mark Tobey became a friend with Teng Baiye in Seattle and was deeply fascinated in Chinese painting and calligraphy, which offered inspiration to the budding artist to forge his own distinctive style. In 1934, after his visit to Naples, Italy, and Hong Kong, Mark Tobey made all his way by boat to see his old friend in Shanghai. And probably Mark Tobey was offered a homestay with Teng Baiye in French Concession, Shanghai, where Mark Tobey continued his studies of Chinese art under the instruction of his long-term tutor. By 1938, China was suffering from the Japanese invasion. Teng Baiye stopped painting anymore, devoted himself to the anti-Japanese war by participating in the refugee industry movement in the camps of Guilin. One can feel rather touched by the unusual friendship embodied between lines of the only surviving letter addressed to Mark Tobey. In fact, only in 1935 did Mark Tobey start his so-called white writing, the innovative network of white lines that cover the surface of his work. That happened after Mark Tobey's discovery of Oriental traditions of ink brushwork in China and Japan, where he found himself, my quote, freed from form by the influence of the calligraphy. So influenced by Oriental art, how did Mark Tobey reach his own visual tropes and distinguish himself as an outstanding artist. Over-composition. This is very rare in traditional Chinese painting, particularly the literati painting, as much more blank space is emphasized in order to give viewers room for imagination. Further specifically, Maktubī did not provide a kind of distinctive figure and ground relationship within this composition. Thus, there was no visual focus or pivot, but only the freedom of permitting viewers to have a wandering vision which could not easily pause and repeat. B. Line above mass. Teng Baiye emphasized more than once, both in his lecture and the papers, the expressive quality of line in Chinese art. And Maktubī even went further by getting rid of any mass with certain configuration of lines, thus reinforcing such expressiveness. Just as Maktubī experienced, my quote, "I have just had my first lesson in Chinese blush from my friend and artist Teng Baiye. The tree is no more solid in the earth, breaking into lesser solids in the earth, breaking into lesser solids bathed in chiaroscuro. There is pleasure and release. Each moment, like tracks in the snow, is record and often loved for itself. The great dragon expressing sky, sun, and shadow, wisdom and spirit vitalized, all is in motion now. One step backward into the past, and the tree in front of my studio in Seattle is all risen, lifting, spring upward," end quote. According to this perception of nature, form is dematerialized and composed of qi, the ever-changing currents of cosmic energy. It was particularly noted by Le Monde when reporting on the death of Maktubī that, owing to Teng Baiye's instruction, Maktubī got insightful perspective for Far Eastern art and reached a completely new pattern in his own work. It can be said that white writing style, what Toby called the calligraphy impulse, characterized by schematized compositions of white lines against a dark background, guided very natural artist's mind, rather more exactly universalist thinking up to a freer level. C. Persistency in line variations. Maktubī kept experimenting with lines and tried to pursue any possible subtle variations in them. The spontaneity and vitality conveyed in his early white writing compositions was still evident in his much later works like Advance of History, finished about 30 years later. Arguably, the wide impulses of line in earlier Broadway norm came to develop into the more delicate and intricate configuration of lines with dazzling width, density, directions, and colors. All these features are more or less related to Oriental art, but distinguish sufficiently Maktubī's work from any lines applied in traditional Chinese art, for instance, and even those of his mentor Teng Baiye's paintings. Teng Baiye seemed to indulge more in the traditional artistic taste of Chinese art. Though there's almost nothing similar between Teng Baiye and Maktubī, one is still curious to know what influence Teng Baiye received from Maktubī, a promising artist and 10 years senior to Teng Baiye. There's no doubt that Teng Baiye was also good at absorbing Western art, and his later achievement in sculpture convincingly proved that. However, is it because he learned so much about Western art and then he more firmly endorsed the traditional Chinese art? Due to the lack of first-hand data, it is difficult to tackle this truly intriguing question. Perhaps it is always right for one to see and admire the uniqueness of mutual influence in art. Not only do Maktubī and Teng Baiye deserve much more extensive and penetrating research, but also more cases should be further examined. American sculptor and designer Noguchi seemed to be to benefit well from Chinese art as well as from Japanese art. But almost no one knows why and how Nokush visited Beijing in 1930. The artist himself, right, was reluctant to talk about his trip to China, and the whole issue became somehow mysterious now. It is a little difficult to understand that he was well received in Beijing and enjoyed quite a luxurious lifestyle. He employed a private cook who could speak French and cook French cuisine, a houseboy, and even a rickshaw boy. Unbelievably, he, half Japanese, became acquainted with General Zhang Xueliang and his men, who all hate Japan. As for the arts, he recorded 28 years later, quite willingly, his 8 months stay in Beijing. Two unforgettable things happened to him. The first striking experience for him was concerning the magnificent monumental Temple of Heaven, or Altar of Heaven. He deemed this ancient architecture as a manifestation of the Chinese worldview, ancient worldview, which considered the Earth to be a massive square in the universe, moving in a circular orbit. The great marble square contains a circular terraces leading to a final open terrace, which forms the Altar of Heaven prop. These would be the first of many stone terraces in Nokush's wandering life, whose symbolism engraved itself in his visual memory and emerged eventually in his own terrace inventions. The square and circle figures that had taken on aesthetic values specific to the modern movement in the palace Nokush just has left were now perceived in his most ancient splendor. The second important event was his learning experience with famed Qi Baishi, then 70-year-old Chinese painting master. It was said that the flower and the bird painting was what Nokush concentrated on and relied on and only on the neophyte level. However, he sensitively and successfully grasped the Oriental temporal consciousness, which helped him his own pursuit of abstract art in both his sculpture and design. It should be said that Chinese influence impacted Nokush, but this kind of influence did not become a direct copy in his later works, but a fairly indiscernible trope, which just proved that the artist was adept in absorbing and transforming foreign art on a superb level. Also, Philippe Gustin's view of Chinese painting is a very fascinating case. As an abstract expressionist, he offered an extremely pertinent and brilliant experience of Chinese Song Dynasty painting, which makes one speculate that the artist must have had a long history of viewing the best Chinese paintings like those kept at the Freer Gallery. There were some cognoscenti guiding him in secret. Otherwise, simply it is too hard to believe that he had such exquisite taste in Song Dynasty painting. I quote, "I think in my studies and brooding about the art of the past, my greatest ideal is Chinese painting, especially Song Dynasty painting dating from about the 10th or 11th century. Song period training involves doing something thousands and thousands of times, bamboo shoots and birds, until someone else does it, not you, and the rhythm moves through you. I think that is what the Zen Buddhists called satori, and I have had it happen to me. It is a double activity when you know and do not know," end quote. To me, at least, Philippe Gustin's response to Song painting is so much higher even than that of experts like Ernest Fenollosa. Thus, it remains a tricky question as to why Philippe Gustin could have so incisive a reflection on Chinese painting. But more significantly, to Philip Guston, no matter how he approached Chinese art, he aspired to have a boundaryless and playful elaboration in his work based on his own understanding of the specific influence, rather than to take direct nourishment from Chinese culture, such as the painting and the poetry of Li Bai, which he liked so much. Might it as well be said that in so doing, his abstract expressionist works became more bewitching? Indeed, there is quite a lot to make one feel intrigued and even awed in the arena concerning Chinese art influence on American counterpart. Now, let's turn to the influence of American art upon Chinese artists. Perhaps there is no more convincing case than the art of Andrew Wyeth. On January 31, 2009, the sixth day of Chinese Spring Festival, the only art weekly in China broke the conventional way and reported that Andrew Wyeth passed away on January 16, 2009, because, my quote, his works can be said to have influenced our 70s to 80s of the last century and even today's China. Chinese oil painter Yang Feiyun put it this way: I guess many Chinese painters would feel much sadder than those in the West about the death of Wyeth. Indeed, the art of Andrew Wyeth formed a tight relationship with Chinese art after the Cultural Revolution. His influence on contemporary Chinese art once reached a climax and blew a kind of Wasserian across China. At least in the 1980s and the 1990s, Wyeth was one of the most famous foreign artists in China, just like Courbet, Delacroix, Van Gogh, etc. The reasons why Wyeth became the most influential figure among Chinese oil painters in the 1980s are not complicated to list. Obviously, the top reason was that after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, there emerged a more and more powerful artistic trend, sentimental realism, which led to the production of an important part of the so-called trauma art. The brave transition from the Cultural Revolution art to the realistic spirit with humanistic concerns resulted in some very touching artwork. However, since the depressing Cultural Revolution of 10 years had recently concluded, the critical inclination in art had to be mild, indirect, and even just very suggestive. As soon as Chinese artists saw Andrew Wyeth's works, certainly only reproductions available back then, they were overwhelmed with the strongest renaissance ever. No doubt, the solemn but at the same time sentimental mood, lonely figures, and isolated scenes depicted in Wyeth's works all seemed the perfect models for Chinese artists to follow. Particularly, Christina's World of 1948 fascinated Chinese artists more than any other of Andrew Wyeth's workers, because the loneliness, sentiment, and hope emphasized in this painting looked strikingly real and moving in the eyes of Chinese painters, who were confined too long to the false passion of the Cultural Revolution. So, to be closer to Wyeth's world amounted to a rebellion to the red, bright, shiny style prevailing during the Cultural Revolution in China. The most brilliant trope was spring wind has been awakened created by He Duoling, then a young student at the Sichuan Academy of Fine Arts in Chongqing. The artist took 3 months to finish this work in 1981, not only bring out his own mature style for the first time, but also contributing a landmark work to the history of Chinese oil painting after the Cultural Revolution. Obviously, the painting looks like the typical Weiss world. Early spring, a young girl, shabbily clothed, sitting on the riverbank with withered grass planted all over. She gazed into the far distance perplexedly but affectionately, and the spring breeze blows her black hair. There were also similar pastels and promising implication. The severe winter was already over, and the new life was coming, just like the spring breeze blowing over wilderness and the green plain turning up. He Duoling talked about the influence of Weiss on a few occasions. He loved this sentimental American realist painter for the latter's cool meditation and lonely but enchanting horizon. November 17, 2001, He Duoling was interviewed by a journalist in Shanghai, and he said, my quote, "Spring wind has been awakened was my MA graduation work. My supervisor was not in favor of it, so I painted it in secret, because within the painting there were no plot and narration. I sneaked off to leave for Chengdu and painted secretly. I imitated the way that Weiss painted, as blades of glass were painted one by one. This seemed a departure from the traditional realist techniques taught at the academy. They said my work was a marked failure. Later, I submitted it to an exhibition in Beijing, and it was rejected. As they said, the mood embodied in the painting was love subdued, and the girl's facial expression looked rather melancholy. However, the painting was soon published in Fine Art, the leading art journal in China, and was accepted into France's Spring Salon exhibition. He Duoling felt my paintings were awakened of the painting Spring Wind has been awakened, and he painted more radical and highly acclaimed works like Youth, Snow Goose, and A House with a Loft. In a sense, if there were no Weiss, then no He Duoling as well. He Duoling visited US in 1985. After viewing He Duoling's exhibition, an audience recommended to him the poem album by Robinson Jeffers, which was illustrated with the desolate and lonely scenes shot by Edward Weston and Ansel Easton Adams. So this album offered another angle for He Duoling to experience Weiss painting. He cited, "The best oil painters are still those foreigners, and I think that so far there is no single master in China, not at all. Actually, this is He Duoling's special tribute to Andrew Weiss." Not only did He Duoling achieve success and become mature under the influence of Andrew Weiss, but also talented painters like Ai Xuan and Wang Yidong were deeply interested in the poetic melancholy of Andrew Weiss, and their painting depicted ordinary people of merit and dignity, thus contributing masterpieces to the history of contemporary Chinese art. There we go. Ai Xuan famous for portraying Tibetan people, knew the name of Andrew Weiss from another painter, Chen Yifei, in 1981. Later, he had the opportunity to meet with Andrew Weiss in the United States and was presented with 2 autographed painting albums. To him, both Andrew Weiss and his paint friends in China shared many similar characteristics in terms of conveying human feelings, and he could just find what he wanted to say in Andrew Weiss' paintings. In the early 1980s, Asian, still very young, was inspired to paint workers like the influential Shepherd, the morning mist over marshes, and so on. Late, he combined Weiss' melancholy with his Tibetan subject and deliberately expressed a kind of poetic touch in seasonal wind, in Zoid, fans, maybe the sky still be so blue, cold rain, etc. In 2008, painter Wang Yidong visited New York, and he made all the way to Pennsylvania in order to pay a tribute to Andrew Weiss' hometown and to view his masterpieces in museums. In Wang Yidong's oil painting, the similar sentiment and scenes are almost everywhere. The very significance of the art of Andrew Weiss lies not only in its realistic painting techniques, but also in his aesthetic attitude. He marvelously made Chinese painters aware of the essentiality of paying attention to one's mental universe and the aesthetic power of conveying the pursuit of one's soul to surpass the secular reality. One can certainly say that Andrew Weiss offered an inspiring way of looking at the world and life to a whole generation of Chinese artists. In our era, artistic tropes and new achievement have become a more positive phenomenon, which more than often reminds one that references to other cultures and art should be considered on a truly global level. The great Indian sage Tagore said, "We must prepare the field for the cooperation of all the cultures of the world, where all will give and take from others. This is the keynote of the coming age." What a foresight.